Rapid degenerative conditions, the doctors called it. A tragic, invisible rot was eating the most feared man in Chicago from the inside out. After packing their black leather bags and cashing massive checks, the physicians left him to die. Flora was just the girl who changed his ruined sheets. Looking closely was never part of her job, and caring was certainly not allowed. Yet upon discovering the true nature of his ailment, she realized the deadliest monsters in the syndicate were not the ones carrying guns. The Corvo estate didn't smell like money anymore. It smelled like bleach, stale sweat, and dying. Flora kept her head down, pushing the heavy utility cart across the imported marble floors of the second-floor hallway. The wheels squeaked, a tiny, high-pitched protest, in a house that otherwise felt like a mausoleum. Men in tailored suits stood at the ends of the corridors. They didn't speak. They barely breathed. Their hands rested over the subtle bulges in their jackets, their eyes scanning the empty air. They were guarding a corpse that just hadn't stopped breathing yet. Vincent Corvo was 34 years old. 6 months ago, he was a ghost story the city told itself. He owned the ports, the unions, the politicians. Now he couldn't hold a glass of water without his hands violently shaking. She pushed the heavy oak door open to the master suite. The curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the harsh afternoon sun. The room was suffocatingly warm, heavy with the scent of eucalyptus and the metallic tang of illness. "You're late." The voice came from the armchair in the corner. It was a ruin of a voice, raspy and thin, like dry leaves dragged across concrete. Flora parked the cart and reached for her latex gloves. "I'm right on schedule, Mr. Corvo. You've just been awake longer today." She didn't look at him immediately. You didn't stare at Vincent Corvo, especially not now. It felt like a violation. When she finally turned, holding a stack of fresh linens, the sight of him still sent a cold jolt through her ribs. He was swallowed by the dark leather of the armchair. His cheekbones were sharp enough to cut glass, the skin stretched tight and grey over his skull. Dark, bruised hollows sat beneath his eyes. He wore a simple black t-shirt that hung off his withered frame like it belonged to a much larger man. He didn't look like a mob boss. He looked like a stray dog starving in an alley. "The schedule," he muttered, closing his eyes as a spasm racked his chest. He coughed a wet, rattling sound and brought a monogrammed handkerchief to his mouth. When he pulled it away, there was a speck of red. "The schedule is a suggestion by people who have the luxury of time." "I'll strip the bed," she said, her voice flat. Flora didn't do pity. Pity was cheap, and in this house it was usually fatal. She needed the $40 an hour they paid the discreet cleaning staff. She had a brother in a rehab facility out in Colorado, and his facility didn't take "I owe us." She moved to the massive 4-poster bed. The sheets were tangled, soaked with night sweats. She stripped them mechanically, balling them up and shoving them into the laundry bag. Vincent watched her. She could feel his gaze. It was the only thing about him that hadn't degraded. His eyes were a piercing, terrifying pale blue. They still missed nothing. "Dr. Aris is coming at 3, Vincent said. It wasn't conversation. It was a general observation to the room. He's going to run another blood panel. He's going to frown at the chart. He's going to adjust my dosage." "Doctors like to feel useful," Flora said, spraying disinfectant on the mattress protector. "They're parasites, Flora." He leaned his head back against the leather. "They feed on hope, and when the hope runs out, they feed on the denial." A knock sounded at the door. It opened before Vincent could answer. Leo came in. He was Vincent's underboss, his right hand, his childhood friend. Leo filled the doorway broad-shouldered and immaculate in a charcoal suit. He carried a silver tray with a steaming porcelain teapot and a single cup. His face was a mask of practiced heavy grief. "Vince." Leo said softly, stepping into the room. He barely glanced at Flora. She was furniture. Brought you the chamomile. The herbalist swore by it for the nausea. Put it on the desk, Vincent said. He didn't open his eyes. You need to drink it while it's hot. Leo set the tray down. He stepped closer to the chair, looking down at Vincent. The contrast was brutal. Leo was vibrant, flushed with health and power. Vincent was fading into the upholstery. The guys downstairs are asking questions. The shipment from Boston. Tell them to wait. They're getting antsy, Vince, if you just signed the proxy. I said wait. Vincent's voice didn't rise in volume, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The pale blue eyes snapped open, locking on to Leo. For a second, the ghost of the man who ruled Chicago was sitting in that chair. Leo held his hands up in a gesture of surrender. All right, brother. Rest. Drink the tea. Leo turned and walked out, his expensive leather shoes silent on the rug. The heavy door clicked shut. Flora finished tucking the corners of the fitted sheet. She moved to the desk to gather the trash. The teapot was sitting there, steam curling lazily into the dim air. Pour it, Vincent commanded. She picked up the pot and poured the pale golden liquid into the cup. It smelled earthy, almost sweet. Too sweet. She handed it to him. His hand shook so badly the tea sloshed over the rim, burning her thumb. She didn't flinch. She just grabbed a towel from her cart and wiped his knuckles, then her own hand. You don't shake, he noted, taking a slow, painful sip. I'm not the one dying, she said. It slipped out before she could stop it. Her stomach dropped. You didn't speak to the boss like that. Men had been buried in foundations for less. She froze, waiting for him to reach for the panic button to call the guards to have her dragged out. Vincent lowered the cup. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating. Then the corners of his cracked lips twitched. He laughed. It was a terrible broken sound that ended in a coughing fit. But it was a laugh. Honesty. He wheezed, wiping his mouth. God, it's been so long since I heard it, I almost forgot what it sounded like. 2 weeks passed. The house grew quieter. The guards in the halls stood closer together, murmuring in low voices when they thought no one was listening. Power abhors a vacuum, and Vincent Corvo was slowly becoming empty space. Flora's routine remained rigid. Arrive at 6 a.m., clean the east wing, reach the master suite by 1 p.m., change the linens empty, the medical waste, sanitize the surfaces, survive the hour. Dr. Aris practically lived at the estate now. He was a sleek, silver-haired concierge doctor who charged $10,000 a visit and always smelled like expensive cologne and peppermint. He had set up an IV pole next to Vincent's bed, pumping him full of fluids, vitamins and painkillers. His liver enzymes are elevated, Dr. Aris was saying, one Tuesday, standing at the foot of the bed, while Flora polished the mahogany dresser. Leo was standing beside him, arms crossed. Vincent was in the bed, hooked up to the IV. He looked worse. His skin had taken on a bizarre, faint, yellowish-grey tint. He was barely conscious, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic jerks. "What does that mean, Doc?" Leo asked. His voice was thick with concern. "It means his body is shutting down. The neurotoxins from the initial viral infection have caused cascading organ failure. I'm increasing the immunosuppressants." Aris adjusted a dial on the IV drip. "We're just managing pain now, Leo. You need to prepare yourself. A few weeks, maybe less." Leo dragged a hand down his face. "Do whatever you have to do to keep him comfortable. Money is no object." "I'll prepare the new IV bags," Aris said, picking up his leather case. "Keep the room cool. They both left. The door clicked. Flora stopped polishing. The room was silent except for the rhythmic hiss-click of the oxygen concentrator in the corner. She walked over to the bed. Vincent's eyes were shut. His breathing was wet. She looked at the IV bag hanging from the metal pole. It was a standard saline bag, but Iris injected something into the port every day. Vitamins, he called it. A bespoke cocktail to help the liver. She reached out and adjusted the blanket over Vincent's chest. His skin was freezing. His hand shot out. It was weak, his grip barely stronger than a child's, but his cold, bony fingers wrapped around her wrist. She jumped. His eyes opened. They were bloodshot, the whites turning yellow, but the blue iris was wide, frantic. "Water!" he croaked. She poured a glass from the pitcher on the nightstand and slipped her arm behind his shoulders to lift him. He weighed nothing. He drank greedily, coughing as the water hit his throat. She eased him back down. "You shouldn't let them talk about you, like you're already dead," she said quietly, taking the glass. "I am already dead, Flora." His eyes tracked her as she moved to the cart. "I'm just a corpse dealing with the paperwork." "You gave up. I'm out of moves." He stared at the ceiling. 10 doctors. Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins. No one knows what it is. A mystery virus, a genetic anomaly. I fought my way out of the gutters, built an empire, and I'm being taken down by something I can't even see. She looked at his nightstand. The silver tray was there. A fresh cup of chamomile tea. Leo brought it like clockwork, twice a day. The herbalist's remedy. "Does that stuff actually help?" she asked, nodding to the tea. Vincent barely glanced at it. "It tastes like dirt, but Leo insists. It coats the throat." Flora didn't say anything else. She finished her cleaning, packed her cart, and wheeled it out. That night it rained. A cold, relentless Chicago downpour that turned the streets to black mirrors. She took the bus back to her cramped apartment, the damp seeping into her coat. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring at a stack of past-due bills and a letter from the rehab clinic. "Payment required by the 1st or discharge proceedings will begin." She rubbed her temples. She needed to ask for an advance. She dreaded the thought. Going to Leo, who handled the payroll now that Vincent was bedridden, meant stepping into the crosshairs. Leo smiled too much. His eyes were cold, but she had no choice. The next day she arrived at the estate early. She needed to catch Leo before he left for his morning meetings. She found him in the study pouring himself a scotch at 8 a.m. "Flora," he said, looking surprised as she knocked on the open door frame. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I need an advance on my pay, Mr. Rossi. 2,000. I'll work double shifts to pay it off." Leo took a sip of his drink. He leaned against the heavy oak desk, studying her. 2,000. That's a lot of sheets to wash. I have a family emergency. We all have emergencies." He set the glass down. He walked toward her. The space between them vanished too quickly. He stopped just a foot away, looking down. She smelled the scotch on his breath, mixed with mint. "Things are complicated right now, Flora. Vince is... well, you see it. The accounts are locked down. I'm paying for his care out of my own pocket right now, until the lawyers sort out the proxy." It was a lie. She knew it was a lie. The Corvo Syndicate had millions in liquid cash hidden in walls alone. "I understand," she said, keeping her voice level. She took a step back. "Sorry to bother you. Hold on." Leo reached into his pocket. He pulled out a thick money clip, peeling off several crisp $100 bills. He held them out. "Take this. On me. Consider it a bonus for dealing with the Grim Reaper upstairs." She stared at the money. It was exactly 2,000. She hated taking it from him. It felt dirty. But she thought of her brother. She reached out and took the bills. "Thank you," she said. "Just keep doing your job, Flora. Keep things clean. Don't ask questions, and we'll get along fine." His smile didn't reach his eyes. She nodded and walked out. Her skin crawled. It happened on a Thursday. Vincent was asleep. The breathing was worse, a wet rattle that echoed off the high ceiling of the master suite. Dr. Aris had come and gone, leaving a fresh all-V bag hanging on the pole, a clear liquid dripping slowly down the line into a vein in Vincent's bruised arm. Flora was emptying the medical waste bin. Dr. Aris usually took the empty vials with him, but he had been in a rush today. He had left a small, unlabeled glass ampule sitting on the edge of the sink in the ensuite bathroom. She picked it up with a gloved hand to toss it into the sharps container. A drop of liquid clung to the rim of the broken glass. It slipped off, landing squarely on the heavy silver ring she wore on her left index finger. It was cheap silver, a gift from her brother years ago, slightly tarnished. She wiped it off with her thumb. Instantly, a sharp, burning sensation bit into her skin through the thin latex glove. She hissed, tearing the glove off. The skin on her thumb was turning a bright, angry red, blistering almost immediately. She ran her hand under the cold water faucet, her heart hammering. What the hell was in that vitamin shot? She looked at her ring. Where the drop had landed, the cheap silver had turned pitch black, the metal visibly pitted and eaten away in a matter of seconds. Vitamins didn't corrode metal. Immunosuppressants didn't burn through latex. She turned off the water. The bathroom was silent. She looked out the open door into the bedroom. Vincent was completely still. Her mind raced connecting dots she hadn't wanted to see. His liver enzymes are elevated, cascading organ failure, his skin turning yellow, his hair thinning, the violent tremors. It wasn't a mystery virus. It wasn't a genetic anomaly. He was being poisoned, slowly, methodically, right in front of a dozen armed guards. She looked at the ampule in the trash. Then she walked out to the bedroom and stared at the IV bag slowly dripping into Vincent's arm. Aris. The doctor was poisoning him. Panic flared in her chest. She needed to tell someone. She needed to tell the guards downstairs. No. She stopped in her tracks. The guards worked for Leo. Leo, who brought the tea twice a day. Leo, who was paying the doctor. Leo, who was desperately trying to get Vincent to sign a proxy before he died. If she walked downstairs and told the guards, she wouldn't leave this house alive. She looked at Vincent. He looked dead already. Why should she care? She had her money. Her brother was safe for another month. She was a maid. If the mob wanted to eat itself from the inside out, she should just pack her cartwalk out the front door and never look back. She took a step toward the door. Vincent groaned. It was a weak, pitiful sound. His head rolled on the pillow. He was drowning in his own body, suffocating slowly, while the men who called him brother watched the clock. She cursed under her breath. She walked over to the IV pole. She reached out and clamped the line, stopping the drip. She pulled the needle out of his arm. He didn't even flinch. She pressed a piece of gauze to the puncture wound and taped it down. She grabbed the IV bag off the hook and shoved it into the bottom of her trash bag, burying it under wet paper towels. She replaced it with a bag of pure, sterile saline from the supply closet, hooking it up to a fresh line and securing it to his arm. She was terrified. Her hands shook so badly she almost dropped the tape. She moved to the nightstand. The tea was there, freshly poured. She picked it up. She couldn't just throw it away. Leo would notice. She walked into the bathroom and poured the tea down the drain. She rinsed the cup, leaving just a tiny bit at the bottom, so it looked like it had been drunk. She walked back into the bedroom. Vincent's eyes were open. They were cloudy, but he was staring right at her. "What are you doing?" he whispered. Her heart jumped into her throat. She stood frozen by the bed. "I'm changing your sheets." "You touched the IV." She swallowed hard. The room felt incredibly small. The line was kinked. He stared at her. He was dying, weak, practically immobile, but the sheer force of his presence still demanded truth. She leaned over the bed. She kept her voice so low it barely disturbed the air. "They're killing you," she whispered. "The doctor. Leo. It's not a virus. It's poison. They're dosing your IV and your tea." Vincent didn't gasp. He didn't shout. His eyes just slowly closed. A terrifying, absolute stillness fell over him. For a long second, she thought the shock had literally killed him. Then his chest heaved. A long, ragged breath escaped his lips. When he opened his eyes again, the yellow haze seemed to have receded, just a fraction, replaced by something infinitely more dangerous. The dying stray dog was gone. The boss of the Chicago syndicate was back, trapped in a broken cage. "Can you walk?" she whispered. "No," he rasped. "Legs. Numb. We need to get you out of here. If Eris realizes the IV was swapped, or Leo realizes the tea is going down the drain." "Flora." His voice was barely a breath, but it stopped her. "In the floorboards, under the rug. By the dresser." She looked at the heavy Persian rug. She dropped to her knees, shoving the heavy oak dresser aside an inch enough to pull the rug back. The hardwood floor looked perfectly smooth. She pressed her fingers against the grain. One of the planks shifted slightly. She pried it up. Inside the small cavity was a matte black Glock 19, a thick stack of passports, and a heavy brass key. "Take the gun," Vincent whispered from the bed. She grabbed the cold metal. She had never held a gun in her life. It felt impossibly heavy. "I don't know how to use this," she said, standing up, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. "Point. Pull." He coughed a dry, racking sound. "Lock the door." She ran to the heavy oak door and slid the deadbolt home with a loud clack. "What now?" she asked, backing away from the door, the gun hanging awkwardly in her grip. "Now." Vincent breathed, his eyes fixed on the locked door. "We wait for Leo to realize he's bleeding out a ghost." Suddenly, the heavy brass handle of the bedroom door jiggled. She stopped breathing. The handle twisted harder. Then, a sharp knock. "Vince!" It was Leo. His voice was muffled through the thick wood, but the casual, practiced grief was gone. He sounded tense. "Vince, open the door. Dr. Aris forgot his case." She looked at Vincent. He slowly turned his head, his pale blue eyes locking onto hers. He gave a microscopic shake of his head. "Flora." Leo's voice changed. The pitch dropped. The friendliness vanished. "I know you're in there. I saw your cart in the hall. Open the door." She backed up until her shoulders hit the wall. The gun felt slick with her sweat. "Flora." Leo said his voice, now a low, flat command that sent a chill straight down her spine. "Open the door right now, or I'm coming through it." The heavy brass handle stopped jiggling. A thick, suffocating silence pressed against the bedroom door. Flora kept the Glock pointed at the wood, her arms trembling so violently the sights blurred. The gun was a solid block of ice in her sweaty palms. "Step away from the door," Vincent rasped. His voice was barely a hiss, but the authority in it snapped her paralysis. She scrambled backward, her cheap, rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the polished floorboards until her spine hit the edge of the mattress. "Vince, this is getting ridiculous," Leo called out. The false warmth was entirely gone. His voice was flat, carrying the mechanical efficiency of a man who arranged funerals for a living. "I'm coming in." A deafening crack shattered the air. Wood splintered inward as a bullet punched through the deadbolt. She screamed, dropping to her knees and covering her ears. Another shot rang out, blowing the rest of the locking mechanism into jagged shards of brass and oak. The door kicked open, rebounding off the wall with a heavy thud. Leo stood in the doorway. He held a suppressed pistol in his right hand. Dr. Aris hovered behind him in the hallway, clutching his leather medical bag like a shield. Leo's eyes swept the room. They bypassed her on the floor entirely and locked onto the bed. Vincent was sitting up. He looked like a corpse propped up for a wake, his skin grey and shining with cold sweat, but he held a small black remote control in his trembling hand. "Take another step, Leo," Vincent said. His voice was a ruined whisper, but it carried across the room. "And I press this." Leo froze. His eyes darted to the remote, then to the corners of the room. He knew this house. He knew the paranoia that built it. "What is that, Vince?" Leo asked, his tone cautious. He didn't lower his gun. "Incendiary charges." Vincent lied. He didn't even blink. "Wired into the oxygen lines in the walls. You step inside and the three of us burn together." It was a bluff. It had to be a bluff. The remote looked exactly like the one that controlled the motorized blinds. But Leo didn't know that, and Vincent's pale, bloodshot eyes were perfectly empty. He looked like a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Leo hesitated. That second of doubt was all Vincent needed. "Flora." Vincent commanded, not breaking eye contact with his underboss. "The closet." She scrambled to her feet, keeping her head low. She practically crawled toward the massive walk-in closet on the left side of the room. "You're making a mistake, Vince," Leo said, his jaw tightening. "You're sick. You're confused. Aris just needs to give you your medication." "His medication is corroding the plumbing, Leo." Vincent wheezed. His thumb hovered over the remote's main button. "I know. Now back up. Both of you. Into the hall." Leo's grip on his pistol shifted. He was calculating the odds. Could he shoot Vincent before Vincent pressed the button? "I won't tell you again," Vincent said. Leo took a slow step backward into the hall. He grabbed Dr. Aris by the collar and shoved the doctor behind him. "All right, Vince, have it your way. But there's no way out of this room. You're a dead man walking." "I've been dead for a month," Vincent replied. "Close the door." Leo reached out and pulled the splintered door shut. The moment the latch clicked, Vincent dropped the remote. His entire body collapsed against the pillows, a violent coughing fit racking his frail chest. He brought a hand to his mouth, pulling it away, stained with fresh, bright blood. "Help me," he choked out, waving a weak hand toward her. She shoved the gun into the waistband of her scrubs and ran to the bed. She grabbed his arm, pulling it over her shoulder. He smelled like dying flowers and copper. She dragged him upright. He was shockingly light, all bone and loose skin, but hauling dead weight was still a brutal effort. "Where are we going?" she grunted, dragging him toward the closet. Her legs burned with the effort. "Back wall." He panted his feet, dragging uselessly across the carpet. "Behind the shoe racks. Press the panel. Third shelf from the bottom." They tumbled into the dark, cedar-lined closet. It smelled intensely of expensive cologne and polished leather. She propped him against a row of Italian suits and dropped to her knees in front of the built-in mahogany shoe rack. She counted up 3 shelves and pushed hard against the back panel. There was a soft click. The entire heavy shelving unit swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a pitch-black, narrow void between the walls. "Get in," Vincent urged his head, rolling against the hanging suits. She pulled him up again, practically throwing him into the dark space, and scrambled in after him. She grabbed the edge of the shoe rack and pulled it shut just as the main bedroom door was kicked open violently. "Vince!" Leo's voice roared. Heavy footsteps pounded into the bedroom. Flora held her breath, in the total darkness of the wall cavity, her shoulder pressed tight against Vincent's shaking frame. The space was no wider than a coffin. It smelled of old dust, dry rot, and mice. A faint strip of LED lighting hummed to life along the floorboards when the secret door closed, casting a sickly pale glow over the raw wood studs and exposed fiberglass insulation. Vincent was slumped against the plywood backing of the closet, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like he was going to pass out. Through the wall she could hear the chaos in the bedroom. Closets being torn open, furniture overturning Leo, barking orders at guards who had rushed upstairs. "They're not here!" a deep voice shouted. "Check the windows, check the bathrooms," Leo yelled. A heavy thud shook the wall right next to her head. She bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, squeezing her eyes shut. "He's too weak to climb out a window." "Leo," Dr. Aris's voice filtered through the wood, sounding panicked. "He can't walk, and his liver is failing. He won't last 24 hours without the IV." "You said he was a vegetable, you idiot," Leo snapped. "You said the dosage was keeping him compliant." "I don't know what happened. Maybe the maid." "Find the maid. Kill her. Don't touch Vince. I need his thumbprint for the biometric safe." Flora felt a cold lump of pure terror settle in her stomach. Kill her. They were going to slaughter her and throw her in a landfill like loose trash just because she was in the room. She wasn't a person to them. She was a loose end. She looked down at Vincent. He was staring at her, his eyes gleaming in the faint LED light. "Still think this isn't your problem?" he whispered, a grim blood-stained smirk on his face. "Shut up," she hissed back. "Where does this go?" "Down, to the old coal chute, leads to the service garage." He tried to push himself up and failed, sinking back with a groan. "You have to walk. I'll lean on you." "I can't carry you down a flight of stairs," she said, panic threading her voice. "You're dead weight." "Then leave me here," he said plainly. "They'll find me eventually. You take the tunnel. Get out." She stared at him. It was the smart play. Ditch the dying mob boss, slip out the back, disappear. She could take the $2,000 in her pocket, grab her brother from rehab, and run to Canada. But she thought of the way Leo had smiled at her this morning. She thought of the poison burning a hole through her cheap silver ring. The casual cruelty of it all. They had stripped Vincent of his dignity piece by piece, locking him in his own failing body while they stole his life. She hated the mob, but she hated bullies more. "Put your arm around my neck," she snapped, grabbing his wrist. He didn't argue. She hoisted him up, groaning, as his weight settled entirely onto her left side. They began to move down the narrow passageway. It was agonizingly slow. The floor slanted downward, turning into a steep, narrow set of wooden stairs built into the bones of the house. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. Vincent's breathing was a wet, ragged rattle in her ear. He was burning up, radiating a feverish heat that soaked through her scrubs. "How long have they been poisoning me?" he asked between gasps, his head lolling against her shoulder. "I don't know," she muttered, focusing on the stairs. "Weeks, months. Dr. Oris was putting something in your IV, and Leo was putting it in your tea." Vincent let out a harsh, bitter sound that might have been a laugh. "The chamomile. My mother used to make that for me when I was a kid. Leo knew that." "Sociopaths are observant," she grunted, taking another step. "He's not a sociopath," Vincent whispered, his voice fading. "He's just greedy. Greed is simpler." They reached the bottom of the stairs. The passage opened up, slightly terminating, at a heavy, iron-reinforced door. The air here was damp, smelling of motor oil and concrete. They were in the basement. The garage, Vincent said. He was slipping. His chin rested heavily on his chest. Open it. She leaned him against the cold concrete wall. She reached into her waistband, gripping the handle of the Glock. She didn't pull it out, but she kept her hand on it as she pressed the heavy iron latch of the door. It swung open with a muted groan. They stepped out into the cavernous underground garage of the Corvo estate. It was dimly lit by fluorescent tubes that buzzed like angry hornets. Several high-end SUVs and luxury sedans sat parked in neat rows. The rain was hammering against the concrete ramp leading up to the street level, a steady driving roar that masked their footsteps. "Which car?" she whispered, looking around frantically. "Can't take... mine," Vincent slurred. He was staring at the floor, fighting to stay conscious. "Trackers. Take the staff car. Grey Honda." She spotted it near the back. A battered, unassuming grey Honda Civic, used by the kitchen staff for grocery runs. It was perfect. She dragged Vincent toward it, ducking behind the massive bulk of a black Escalade as they moved. They were halfway there when a heavy metal door at the far end of the garage slammed open. "I'm telling you, they're not down here." A gruff voice echoed off the concrete. She froze, dragging Vincent down into a crouch behind the rear tire of the Escalade. She peeked around the bumper. 2 guards in dark suits were walking down the ramp from the house, sweeping flashlights across the dark corners of the garage. "Leo says check everything. So we check everything," the second guard replied. He racked the slide of an assault rifle. The sharp metallic clack cut through the sound of the rain. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. They were trapped. There was 30 feet of open concrete between them and the Honda. She looked at Vincent. His eyes were closed. His breathing had stopped being a rattle and had turned into a terrifying, shallow silence. He was dying right here on the garage floor. She pulled the Glock from her waistband. She had never fired a gun. She didn't even know if the safety was on. She looked at the black metal in her hands, feeling entirely out of her depth. She wasn't a killer. She was a maid who washed sheets and scrubbed toilets. The beams of the flashlights swept closer, illuminating the front grille of the Escalade. Think, she told herself. Don't panic. Think. She looked around the garage floor. 10 feet away, sitting on a metal utility shelf, was a stack of heavy lead-acid car batteries and a rack of spare tires. She looked at the gun in her hand. She didn't need to shoot the guards. She just needed to give them a reason to look the wrong way. She gripped the gun with both hands. She aimed it not at the men, but at the windshield of a pristine, cherry-red Ferrari parked on the opposite side of the garage directly behind them. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil was a physical blow, snapping her wrists back with brutal force. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed concrete space, ringing in her ears like a physical pain. Across the garage, the Ferrari's windshield exploded into a million glittering diamonds. The car's alarm instantly began shrieking a high-pitched, piercing wail that filled the entire basement. "Over there!" one of the guards yelled, spinning around and leveling his rifle at the ruined sports car. Both men sprinted away from the guns raised, moving toward the noise. It was her only chance. She grabbed Vincent by the collar of his shirt and dragged him across the open concrete. He groaned in pain, his shoes scraping loudly, but the wailing car alarm drowned out the noise. They reached the grey Honda. She yanked the passenger door open, shoved him inside, and slammed it shut. She ran around to the driver's side and threw herself into the seat. The keys were tucked into the sun visor, a sloppy habit of the kitchen staff that she had noticed weeks ago. She grabbed them, jammed the key into the ignition, and twisted. The engine sputtered, then caught with a weak whine. She threw it in, reverse backed out recklessly, and slammed the shifter into drive. She didn't turn the headlights on. She hit the gas, the tires squealing against the polished concrete, and aimed the car up the steep ramp toward the metal security gate. The gate was closed. "Hold on!" she screamed entirely to herself, because Vincent was completely unresponsive. She floored the accelerator. The little Honda surged up the ramp, hydroplaning slightly on the slick, rain-soaked concrete. They hit the metal gate at 40 miles an hour. The impact sounded like a bomb going off. The windshield cracked in a massive spiderweb pattern, the airbags failed to deploy, and the front bumper folded inward. But the cheap aluminum of the security gate buckled outward, snapping off its hinges with a horrible screech of rending metal. They burst through the gate and launched into the torrential downpour of the Chicago night. She spun the wheel fishtailing onto the wet asphalt of the main road, fighting to gain traction. She finally flipped the headlights on. The wipers slapped frantically against the cracked glass, barely clearing the sheets of rain. She looked in the rearview mirror. No headlights were following them yet. The wailing of the Ferrari alarm faded into the distance, swallowed by the storm. They were out. Her hands were clamped onto the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She was hyperventilating, the adrenaline crashing through her system in violent, icy waves. She looked over at the passenger seat. Vincent's head was leaning against the window, bouncing limply with the motion of the car. His face was entirely devoid of color. He looked dead. "Vincent!" she said, her voice cracking. "Vincent, wake up. Come on, don't do this now." He didn't move. She reached out and pressed 2 fingers against his neck. The skin was clammy and freezing. Beneath it, a pulse fluttered weak, erratic, and fading fast. He didn't have hours. He had minutes. "Where do we go?" she yelled at him, shaking his shoulder. "I can't take you to a hospital. Leo will have people looking there." Vincent's eyelids fluttered. He groaned a sound of absolute, bottomless agony. He slowly turned his head toward her. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, staring right through her. "Pocket," he whispered, his lips barely moving. "Coat pocket." She reached across the console, jamming her hand into the pocket of the black jacket he had been wearing when she dragged him out of bed. Her fingers brushed against a piece of heavy cardstock. She pulled it out and flipped on the dome light for a second. It was a faded, water-damaged business card. No name, no company logo, just an address printed in plain black ink on the south side of the city, and a single word written on the back in messy handwriting. Gideon. She looked back at Vincent. He had passed out again, his chin resting on his chest, the slow, agonizing rattle returning to his lungs. She shoved the card into her pocket, turned off the dome light, and pressed the gas pedal to the floor. They disappeared into the black, rain-soaked streets, a dying king and a maid with a gun running out of time. The address on the card belonged to a boarded-up veterinary clinic, wedged between a liquor store and a burnt-out laundromat in Englewood. She parked the battered Honda in the alley behind the building, killing the engine. The rain had slowed to a miserable, freezing drizzle. She stared at the peeling paint on the steel back door, then at the dying man in her passenger seat. Vincent was completely unresponsive. His breathing was a faint, irregular hitch. She grabbed the Glock, shoved it into her scrubs, and got out. She pounded on the steel door with her fist. The sound echoed down the empty alley. Nothing. She pounded again, harder, scraping her knuckles against the cold metal. "Gideon!" she yelled, her voice cracking with panic. "Open the door." A heavy deadbolt scraped back. The door cracked open 2 inches, stopped by a thick steel chain. A single dark brown eye peered out from the gloom. The smell of rubbing alcohol and old coffee drifted into the alley. "Clinic's closed," a rough voice grunted. "Take your stray somewhere else." "I don't have a dog," she said, gasping for breath. "I have Vincent Corvo. He's dying." The eye widened slightly. The door slammed shut, the chain rattled, and then it swung wide open. A tall, painfully thin man stood in the doorway. He wore a stained white t-shirt and faded jeans. His arms were covered in faded, sprawling tattoos, and his face was a map of deep, exhausted lines. He didn't look like a doctor. He looked like a guy who had seen the bottom of the world and decided to set up camp there. He pushed past her, walking straight to the Honda. He yanked the passenger door open, shining a small pen light into Vincent's face, checking his pupils, then pressing 2 fingers to his neck. "Christ," Gideon muttered. "Help me get him inside. If his heart stops in this alley, I'm not doing CPR in the mud." In. They hauled Vincent out of the car. Gideon took the brunt of his weight, moving with surprising strength for a man who looked half-starved. They dragged him through a dark, cluttered hallway and down a flight of concrete stairs into a sprawling, brightly lit basement. It was a fully functional underground trauma bay. Steel surgical tables, heart monitors, locked glass cabinets, filled with medical supplies. It was impeccably clean, a stark contrast to the decaying building above. "On the table," Gideon ordered. They hoisted Vincent onto the cold steel. Gideon moved with manic efficiency. He grabbed a pair of heavy trauma shears and cut Vincent's black shirt straight down the middle, tossing it to the floor. Vincent's torso was a terrifying landscape of prominent ribs and deep yellow-purple bruising. Gideon hooked him up to a monitor. The machine immediately began emitting a fast, erratic, and terrifyingly faint beep. "What happened?" Gideon asked, plunging a thick needle into Vincent's left arm to start an IV line. "They were poisoning him," Flora said, wrapping her arms around herself to stop shaking. "His doctor, his underboss. I think they were putting it in his IV and in his tea." Gideon paused, looking at the dark, inflamed veins tracking up Vincent's arms. He grabbed a small flashlight and opened Vincent's mouth, examining his gums. Then he looked at Vincent's thinning hair. "Thallium," Gideon said grimly. "Heavy metal, tasteless, colorless, rat poison, basically. The mob's favorite toy in the 70s. It mimics potassium, so the body just absorbs it right into the nervous system. Shuts down the organs one by one. Can you fix him? Fix him." Gideon let out a humorless laugh, hanging a bag of clear fluid on a hook above the table. "He's got enough heavy metal in his blood to build a Buick. His liver is the size of a walnut. He's crashing." Gideon turned to a cabinet and pulled out a large glass vial of dark blue liquid. "Prussian blue," he said, drawing the liquid into a massive syringe. "It binds to the thallium in the digestive tract. But if it's already bound to his tissues, it's a coin toss." He injected the blue liquid into Vincent's IV port. Then he turned to her. "Who are you?" "Flora. I clean his house." Gideon stared at her for a long, heavy second. He looked at the cheap wet scrubs she was wearing and the heavy outline of the Glock weighing down her waistband. "A maid," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Vince Corvo survives a dozen cartel hits, and his life comes down to a maid with a stolen gun." "All right, Flora. Grab those blankets. We have to bring his core temperature up." Then we wait. The next 12 hours were a masterclass in agony. Flora sat on a plastic folding chair in the corner of the basement, watching the heart monitor. Gideon worked tirelessly. He pumped Vincent full of fluids, administered aggressive diuretics to force his kidneys to flush the poison, and pushed doses of atropine when his heart rate dropped dangerously low. Vincent seized twice, violent arching convulsions that threatened to snap his brittle bones. She had to hold his shoulders down against the steel table, while Gideon shoved a bite block into his mouth to keep him from biting off his own tongue. By dawn, the basement smelled like sweat and copper. Gideon slumped into a rolling chair across from her, wiping his face with a towel. He was exhausted. "Why do you owe him?" she asked quietly. Gideon looked up. He glanced at Vincent, who was finally still, his breathing deeper, more rhythmic. "I was a trauma surgeon at Chicago Med," Gideon said, his voice raspy. "I developed a gambling habit, got in deep with the wrong Russian crew. They came to the hospital to break my hands. Vince happened to be visiting one of his guys in the ICU. He saw it happening. He paid my debt. Told me my hands were too useful to be broken." Gideon nodded toward the table. "He's a ruthless bastard, Flora. He's killed men. He's ruined lives. But he respects a skill, and he honors a debt. In his world, that makes him a saint." She looked at Vincent. His face was still pale, but the horrifying, waxy grayness had receded slightly. The monitor beeped with a steady, reassuring rhythm. "Is he going to live?" she asked. "The thallium levels are dropping," Gideon said. "The Prussian blue is working, but he's weak. He'll need weeks of dialysis to fully clear his kidneys. He won't be running any marathons." "He doesn't need to run," a voice rasped from the table. She jumped. Gideon spun his chair around. Vincent's eyes were open. They were bloodshot and exhausted, but the terrifying fog of the poison had lifted. The pale blue irises were sharp, completely lucid, and burning with a quiet, lethal intensity. "He just needs to stand," Vincent whispered. 3 days passed in the underground clinic. The transformation was slow but undeniable. Once the poison stopped dripping into his veins, Vincent's body, fueled by sheer, stubborn rage, began to claw its way back to life. Gideon disconnected the heart monitor on the 2nd day. By the 3rd day, Vincent was sitting up on the edge of the steel table, drinking black coffee and eating dry toast. He still looked skeletal. His skin hung loosely on his frame, and his hands shook violently when he tried to hold the mug. But the dying animal in his eyes was gone. The King of Chicago had woken up. Flora stayed. She didn't mean to. Every morning she told herself she would take the Honda and leave. But she had seen the local news on a small TV Gideon kept in the corner. An unfortunate accident at the Corvo estate. A rogue maid had snapped, shooting a guard and fleeing the scene. Leo was offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to her arrest. She was a ghost now, too. "You should have left me in the closet," Vincent said on the 3rd night. He was sitting in an old leather armchair Gideon had dragged down from the upstairs office. He was wearing a clean grey sweatsuit Gideon had provided. She was sitting on the rolling stool, wrapping a fresh, warm bandage over the bruised IV site on his hand. "And let Leo win." She tied off the bandage. "I don't like Leo. He smiles like a shark." Vincent looked down at his trembling hand. He clenched it into a fist, forcing the tremor to stop for a fleeting second. "He was my brother," Vincent said. The words carried a heavy, dragging weight. It was the first time she heard genuine sorrow in his voice. "We grew up in the same foster home, starved together, bled together. I gave him half my city. It wasn't enough. It's never enough for guys like that," she said. "He wanted the crown." "He wanted the safety of the crown," Vincent corrected, looking up at her. "Leo is a coward at heart. He thought poisoning me slowly was cleaner than putting a bullet in the back of my head. He wanted nature to take the blame." Vincent leaned forward. His pale blue eyes searched her face. There was no pretense between them. They had crossed the threshold of employer and employee hours ago, somewhere between the 2nd seizure and the flight from the garage. "Why did you do it, Flora?" he asked. "You needed the money. You told Leo you had a family emergency. You could have walked away, kept your head down, and collected your paycheck. Why risk your life for a dying criminal?" She looked away. She thought of her brother shivering in a rehab bed in Colorado, fighting his own poison. "Because I know what it looks like when someone is slowly killing themselves," she said softly. and I know what it looks like when someone else is doing it to them. You were fighting. Even when you couldn't move, you were fighting. I couldn't just stand there and hand Leo the shovel. Vincent was quiet. He reached out his cold, rough fingers, gently brushing against her wrist, right over the cheap, tarnished silver ring. "Your emergency," Vincent said. "Who is it?" "My younger brother. Rehab in Colorado. If I don't pay his clinic by the 1st of the month, they kick him out. He won't survive another relapse." Vincent nodded slowly. He didn't offer pity. He just absorbed the information, filing it away in a mind that never stopped calculating. "Pass me the phone," he said, gesturing to a burner cell Gideon had left on the table. She handed it to him. He dialed a number from memory. His hand shook, but his voice, when someone answered, was cold and steady as a glacier. "Percival," Vincent said. A pause. Even across the room, she could hear the sharp intake of breath through the receiver. "Yeah, it's me." Vincent continued, his lips curling into a dark, terrifying smile. "Cancel the flowers. I'm not in the coffin yet. I need you down at the docks. Bring the loyalists. Anyone who took $1 from Leo in the last month, put a bullet in their knee. I'll be there in 2 hours." He hung up and tossed the phone onto the table. He looked at her, pushing himself up from the chair. His legs trembled, and he had to lean heavily on the armrest, but he stood tall. "Flora," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "You washed my sheets when I was dying. Now you're going to help me clean up my syndicate. Get your coat." The back room of the Venezia Social Club was heavy with cigar smoke and the smell of expensive whiskey. It was Friday night. According to Percival's intel, Leo had called a mandatory meeting of the 5 capos who ran the city's districts. He was going to announce Vincent's tragic passing and demand their loyalty. He was stepping up to the throne. He just didn't know the king was waiting in the shadows. They were parked across the street in a black armored SUV Percival had brought. Percival was a massive man with a broken nose and eyes entirely devoid of empathy. He sat in the driver's seat, cleaning his fingernails with a stiletto. Vincent sat in the back with Flora. He looked like death, but death in a tailored suit. Percival had brought him a custom charcoal grey wool suit that hid his skeletal frame. He leaned heavily on a black cane with a silver handle. "You don't have to go in," Vincent said, looking at her. "Percival's men have the exits covered. It's going to be ugly." "I've scrubbed blood out of your carpets," she replied, staring out the tinted window at the club's neon sign. "I think I can handle seeing where it comes from." He studied her for a moment. Then a genuine, albeit small, smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You're a terrifying woman, Flora." "I had a good teacher." Vincent checked his watch. "Time." Percival keyed a radio on his shoulder. "Go." They got out of the SUV. The rain had stopped, leaving the Chicago air crisp and biting. Percival walked, point his hand inside his jacket. She walked beside Vincent. He moved slowly, relying heavily on the cane, his breathing slightly labored, but his posture was terrifyingly straight. Percival kicked the back door of the club open. 2 of Leo's guards turned, reaching for their weapons. Percival drew his suppressed pistol and fired twice before the guards even cleared leather. They dropped to the floor with heavy thuds. Flora flinched, her heart hammering, but she didn't stop walking. Vincent didn't even blink. They walked down a narrow hallway and stopped outside the heavy oak double doors of the back room. Inside, Leo's voice was booming, confident and rich. "A tragedy," Leo was saying. Vince was a visionary, but his illness took his mind before it took his body. "We have to be strong. We have to secure the ports. I've already spoken to the unions. From here on out, the Corvo family answers to me." Vincent placed his pale, trembling hand on the brass handle of the door. He looked at Flora, his eyes burning with blue fire. He pushed the doors open. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was as if the air had been violently sucked out of the building. 5 capos sat around a massive poker table, cigars frozen halfway to their mouths. Leo stood at the head of the table, a glass of scotch raised in a toast. Dr. Aris sat nervously in a chair in the corner, holding a briefcase. Leo's face drained of colour. The scotch glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. "Hello, Leo," Vincent said. His voice wasn't a roar. It was a soft, deadly whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "Vince," Leo stammered, stumbling backward until his legs hit his chair. You're dead. Aris said you were." "Aris is a terrible doctor," Vincent said, taking a slow, agonizing step into the room. His cane clicked loudly against the floorboards. He couldn't even get the dosage right. One of the capos, a scarred man named Rossi, stood up slowly. "Boss, we were told you passed." "I took a vacation," Vincent said, not looking at Rossi. His eyes were locked onto Leo. "I needed to see who would try to steal the silverware while I was gone." Leo swallowed hard. He looked around the room. He saw Percival standing behind Vincent, gun drawn. He saw the cold, furious realization dawning on the faces of the capos. He knew he was trapped. "Vince, wait." Leo pleaded, his hands coming up in a desperate gesture of surrender. "Listen to me. It wasn't me. It was Aris. He approached me with a plan." In the corner, Dr. Oris let out a high-pitched squeak of terror and bolted for the side door. Percival didn't even aim. He just shifted his wrist and fired a single shot. Aris collapsed, clutching his shattered kneecap, screaming in agony. Vincent ignored the doctor. He walked slowly around the table until he was standing 3 feet from Leo. "You brought me chamomile tea," Vincent said softly. "Every day. You stood over my bed, watched me wither away to a skeleton, watched me drown in my own fluids, and you smiled. You told me you loved me, brother." Leo fell to his knees. The polished, confident underboss was gone, replaced by a trembling, sobbing wreck. "I'm sorry. Vince, please. We grew up together. For the old days. Please." Vincent looked down at him. The betrayal was a physical weight in the room, heavy and suffocating. "The old days are dead, Leo," Vincent whispered. "And so are you." Vincent didn't pull a gun. He just nodded to Percival. Flora turned her head away before Percival raised his pistol. The gunshot rang out loud and final, echoing through the cigar smoke. The heavy thud of Leo's body hitting the floor followed a second later. The room was deathly quiet, save for the pathetic whimpering of Dr. Aris in the corner. Vincent turned to the 5 capos. They were rigid, staring at the floor, waiting for his judgment. "Percival is the new underboss," Vincent declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Clean this mess up. Throw the doctor in the river. If anyone mentions Leo's name in this city again, I'll cut out their tongue." "Yes, boss," the capos murmured in unison, heads bowed. Vincent turned and walked back toward Flora. The adrenaline was fading. She could see the sheer exhaustion pulling at the lines of his face. He stumbled slightly. She stepped forward instantly, catching his arm, letting him lean his weight against her. "Let's go home," she said quietly. He looked at her, leaning heavily on her shoulder. The cold, ruthless monster who had just ordered an execution was gone, replaced once again by the broken, tired man she had pulled from a dying bed. "Colorado," Vincent murmured as they walked toward the exit. "What? Your brother," he said, his breath hitching as they stepped out into the cold night air. "Percival already wired the money to the clinic. Paid in full for the next 2 years. He's safe." She stopped walking. She looked up at him, feeling the hot sting of tears behind her eyes. She hadn't cried through the guns, the poison, or the blood. But the sudden overwhelming relief cracked her wide open. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. Yes, I did, Vincent said. He reached out with his free hand, gently wiping a stray tear from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was rough, but incredibly gentle. You gave me my life back, Flora. The least I can do is give you yours. He looked at her, not as a maid, and not as a savior. He looked at her like she was the only real thing in a world built on shadows and lies. Now, he said, the ghost of a smirk returning to his lips, I believe you still owe me a clean set of sheets. She laughed a wet, breathless sound and tightened her grip on his arm. They walked into the dark together. Flora risked everything to save a monster, and in return, the King of Chicago gave her the world. But in the Mafia, blood never washes out completely, and Vincent Corvo's return to the throne is just the beginning of their story. Will their unlikely bond survive the brutal underworld, or will the shadows tear them apart? If you loved this intense, pulse-pounding Mafia drama, show your support. Smash that like button, share this video with a friend, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next dark romance drop. Leave a comment, did Leo get what he deserved?